I want to welcome you all here to St. Francis, the little college of big dreams. For those of you who don't know St. Francis, it's an enormously warm and friendly place with very good students. I want to welcome you on behalf of President Dugan and Chancellor Macchiarola. Chancellor Macchiarola is not feeling well, or he would have been here tonight. When I think of columns, I've been reading newspaper columns since I was I can know exactly how old, since I was 11 years old, the year of Hungary and Suez, when I began reading the newspapers closely. Thought of newspapers columns as sources of intimacy, describe situations that I couldn't possibly be at myself, sources of explanation, and sources of entertainment. When I think of entertainment, I think of Jimmy Cannon. But Cannon was also instructive, but mostly I just enjoyed reading Jimmy Cannon for his verbal pyrotechnics. And Jimmy Cannon is one of the authors included in Deadline Artists. What's fun about this collection, Deadline Artists, is that two people pick it up and they immediately go to different columns. My wife picked it up and immediately went to William Allen White on the death of his daughter and Peggy Noonan on the mood after 9/11. I had read neither of those columns. I read many of the others. But there's so much here that you can find things that will grab you. As for the column itself, Westbrook Pegler in 1938, for those of you who don't know him, he was once the most influential columnist in the United States who went off the deep end. He was expelled in the 1950s from the John Birch Society for being too extreme. No joke, it's true story. Pegler in 1938, when he still had all his marbles, quote, "Of all the fantastic fog shapes that have arisen off the swamp of fusion since the First World War, the most futile and at the same time the most pretentious is the deep-thinking, hair-trigger columnist or commentator who knows all the answers offhand and can settle great affairs with absolute finality 3 days a week or 6 days a week. But," he says, "this is actually only journalistic vaudeville intended to entertain the customers." Not fair, but he catches something there. Column is both serious and entertaining at the same time. When I think of lines from Deadline Artists, it's just one of my favorites comes from Mike Royko, who was the dean of Chicago columnists. Here he's writing on the senior Richard J. Daley in 1976. "So when Daley slid sideways into a sentence, or didn't exit from the same paragraph he entered, it amused us. But it didn't sound any different from the way most of us in Chicago talk. He really caught something." St. Francis is obviously a Franciscan institution, and there's a column about the Franciscans in the collection by Meyer Berger, the famous columnist for the New York Times, who wrote in the 50s and early 60s a column called About New York, a wonderful journalistic effort. And Berger, there's no argument to this. It's a column about how a guy in the Bowery, homeless, alone, alcoholic, bereft, is taken in by Franciscan sisters, and his life restored, his sense of dignity restored, when they find a violin for him to play. It turns out, in the course of talking to him, they discover that he had once been a violinist with the Pittsburgh Symphony. And so their response is to give him a violin to play. And it's a beautiful piece. Now, just so you don't think all the wonderful writing is in the past, and before I introduce our guests, I'm going to quote from one of the people on the panel. I won't tell you who it is yet. One of our panelists on the panel tonight was writing about the Haggerty trial. I hope you're following this. The trial about the guy that Mayor Bloomberg gave $1.1 million. The money disappeared. Bloomberg says it was stolen. Haggerty says you can't steal from Bloomberg. He just gives the money away. In any case, our panelist is talking about Bloomberg's testimony. Occasionally, more glinted through. Asked if he would spend any sum on re-election, the mayor sounded wounded, like a college president explaining tuition costs. I just love that. Since if you read the papers today, the colleges are beginning to figure out you can't increase tuition at 2 and 3 times the rate of inflation indefinitely. And further on in the same column, the columnist is Michael Powell of the Times. He's talking about the sheer insanity of this trial. Bloomberg testified that his campaign, here's the explanation part of the column, testified that his campaign had deputized Mr. Hagerty to negotiate a $1.1 million ballot security program with the Independence Party. Under the terms of the deal, the mayor would donate the money to the Independence Party, which would in turn agree to hire Mr. Hagerty to provide the service. This means that Mr. Hagerty, the volunteer, there are a lot of volunteers who work for Bloomberg for large sums, it means that Mr. Hagerty, the volunteer, was bargaining with himself on behalf of the mayor. That sort of captures the trial, that last line, bargaining with himself on behalf of the mayor. Let me introduce our panelists. First is Phip Avlon, whose wonderful book is making this evening possible. Where's Phip?
I'm over here.
Phip is a former, I was about to say again, screenwriter, speechwriter for Mayor Giuliani, the author of two important books, Independent Nation, about independent voters who are obviously going to be central in this election, and more recently, Wingnuts, about political extremism. He's a columnist for the Daily Beast and Newsweek. He's on CNN. He's going to leave us as soon as the program ends to talk about tonight's debate, which will no doubt put us to sleep if we ever get to watch it. And Phip is also, I don't know how many of you know of John Batchelor's wonderful radio program, which comes on at 9 o'clock every night at ABC. Phip is often on that program. Next to Phip, let me go from this. Let me go from this side. On this side is someone who bears no relation to me whatsoever. His name is Harry Siegel, and he's the columnist for the Village Voice, and he was the second author on a book called Prince of the City about Giuliani's New York. Next to him is Heywood Gould, whose wife, the aforementioned Patty, has not yet arrived. Heywood is best known, I would say, not just for the covers of his books, but for writing for Apache, the Bronx, which I'm sure you've all seen. Also Rolling Thunder, which became something of a cult movie, and The Boys from Brazil, and numerous screenplays and novels. But before he turned to this dishonest line of labor, he was an honest journalist covering the streets of New York for the New York Post before he went Hollywood. To my left is Michael Powell, who I just quoted to you from. Michael was a taxi driver, tenant organizer, writer at Newsday before New York Newsday unfortunately folded. It was actually a very good publication. And now is a New York columnist, the New York columnist for the New York Times. To his left is Josh Greenman. Josh is a columnist for the Daily News, but more importantly, he's the op-ed page editor for the Daily News. So he's going to tell us a bit about what he's looking for in columns. So why don't we begin with you, Phip?
Sure. Thanks, Fred. Thanks for having us here and putting this panel together, and thank you all for coming out. Just briefly, why we decided to put this book together. Myself and Errol Lewis, a columnist at the News and one of Josh's colleagues before he became anchor of New York One. He's not here tonight because he's anchoring inside City Hall. And Jesse Angelo, who's a friend of mine, who's the editor of the Daily and was executive editor of the Post. It was the book we wanted to read as young journalists. And I always think that's a good rule of thumb if you're writing a book. What would you like to read? I previously, Josh and I worked together for Rudy Giuliani as speechwriters, and when you start out as a speechwriter, because there's no program for it, invariably you get or somebody gives you a book by William Safire called Lend Me Your Ears, and it's an anthology of the greatest speeches up to that point. And you sort of, you read them, you internalize them, and it helps you, obviously you know you're not going to hit at that level, but it gives you a sense of context, of tricks, of what works, what doesn't, that sort of thing. So I thought when I began as a columnist at the New York Sun that there'd be a similar sort of book. And was sort of stunned to find out that there wasn't. That there wasn't a sort of comprehensive, updated collection, anthology of America's greatest newspaper columns. And Errol Lewis, who was then at the Sun as well, and I started talking to our colleague Jack Newfield, the great New York columnist. He was at the Sun at the time. And we'd go out to lunch with him and kind of pepper him with questions. You know, what were your favorite columns? What are your favorite columnists? And one day we were at a party at Jack's house, and he and Breslin decided that their favorite column was The Death of Frankie Jerome by Westbrook Pegler. And I hadn't heard of Westbrook Pegler, let alone The Death of Frankie Jerome. So I sent out a researcher to try to find it. It took us 3 months to find this column. It hadn't been anthologized since 1924. And I'll just read you the lead very quickly because that's what decided we needed to do this book. A yellow-haired kid with a mashed-up nose and scalloped lips dipped his fingers in the holy water fount of St. Jerome's Church, crossed himself with the fist that killed Frankie Jerome, and went to his knees on the cold marble to pray when all that was left of the little fellow was wheeled up the aisle to the altar yesterday for the funeral mass that preceded the journey to the grave. That's the lead. That's the lead graph. It's one sentence. And what you realize there is that the column should be considered an art form, that this is literary journalism. And so the process of putting the book together began. We decided we'd organize it thematically: war, politics, sports, humor, crime, civil rights, farewells, a coda section called Pursuit of Happiness, and really bring together these sort of vital voices from the past. And for us, it was an education, it was an inspiration, and made you realize the capacity for the column. As young journalists, I think, in part because many of these columns aren't available on the internet, there is a tendency for those of us writing online to drift simply towards opinion, which is a lot of typing. And in the process, the art of the reported column, which the vast majority of these are, is in danger of being lost. And so part of the point of this book was to try to bring the best of the past in one volume to help us realize, how high the bar in fact is. And that this is an art form, and that craftsmanship matters. That simply, blurting out your opinion is not a substitute for reporting and characters and storytelling. And you can tell the columnists, there's some things that are transcendent. The immediacy of a voice. The primacy, be yourself matters no matter what area you're writing in. But the writing that was done especially before television, you did get a sense that there too they were writing vivid descriptive writing. They felt an obligation to have a scene come alive in the mind of a reader. And that is in danger of being lost as well. So really what this book was, it was just a love letter to this art form. And a challenge, I think, to our generation to, in the same way that, young jazz musicians still listen to old records, it's been harder to get access to these classic old columns and to learn from them. And to realize you're not going to necessarily hit that pitch, but here's the ballpark. This is the contours. These are some of the great figures who came before. And there is that sense then of maybe intergenerational competition that can be stoked. And it's been so fun. Putting the book together was fun for me. Cutting some of the columns was a heartbreaker. And since it's come out, there's been great conversations about you should put in this column that. And we've said we'd love to do a volume 2 if there's interest. And the book's selling very well. We were number 62 on Amazon last week, which, and it's sort of fresh. And I think this is a book that's going to snowball. But the comments have been great because people are finding these beloved but half-remembered columns. And it's starting a conversation, again, about this American art form. And that was our goal. So I guess with that, let's have a conversation about it.
Michael, you want to go next?
Sure. One of the joys, actually, of reading this collection is, your mind's eye, as Fred was indicating. We all have kind of our favorites, right? And I grew up with Murray Kempton, so I sort of, so my eye sort of naturally went to wherever Murray Kempton was mentioned. And actually, Murray was famous for essentially always sort of taking the underdog. I never forget his 75th birthday. At Newsday, there were all these flower corsages sent from the widows of various mafia dons, all of whom were absolutely charmed by him. And Mario Cuomo once was complaining to Sidney Schanberg and said, "What the hell do I have to do to get Murray to write one good word about me?" And Sidney said, "You have to get indicted." And which was true. Murray was never, but there was one. Oh geez. Well, anyway, I'll return to it. But there was a wonderful George Will column in here with a terrific lead that was absolutely devastating, I thought, on George Bush, and sort of summed it up
the sound of a laptop.
So deftly, yeah. And it kind of reminded me. I did not, dip into this coming here tonight thinking I was going to look at George Will, but I looked at it, and it was just a really elegant piece of writing and observation. And I suppose that, for myself, as somebody who's, if you will, still sort of swimming out into the lake of column writing. I mean, I very much grew up around and, as I say, worked alongside Breslin and Kempton and others. And, you know, from them, you got the importance of, as Woody Allen said, showing up, you know, seeing it. And if you can be there at a trial or wherever, it isn't just that you're doing the reporting, but that if you can force yourself to keep seeing it afresh, it has it sort of, if you will, sort of sparks a series of thoughts which, taken together with intense quantities of adrenaline that comes with the panic of realizing the deadline's a few hours away, sometimes, occasionally, can produce some inspiration. But I've loved this. I mean, I grew up in New York City. I grew up on columnists from, you know, Pete Hamill to Kempton to, I mean, all this, and it was just this, it was sort of a great thrill to kind of look at this book and to realize the extent to which you can give voice to a moment. You can be, you hope, counterintuitive. And I think that perhaps I find one of the biggest challenges as a columnist is to avoid becoming too predictable. And, you know, we all have our biases, our views, and this sort of thing. So it's that trying to kind of vary your step, your punch, your beat, I think is the real challenge. And I guess I'll conclude with, you know, I'm particularly struck because I'm a piker. I write once and at most twice a week online. I'll never forget Murray Kempton, who was, again, this very elegant fellow at the age of 76, going into one of his rare snits because Newsday had cut him back from 4 days to 3. So I'll leave it to Murray.
Heywood, you want to pick up there? Because Heywood at the Post knew many of the great columnists.
Well, I was a copy boy. I was actually named after a columnist, Heywood Broun.
I'm wondering that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, he was my father's favorite columnist, and when they had to name me with an H, they didn't want to name me Harry, you know, so they named me Heywood, which was a problem for the first 15 years of my life, but it got better. And he actually wrote a column that my father always spoke about, which is in this collection. Really? It's a column about the spirit of St. Louis. Oh, good. And about how Heywood Broun brought to the attention of New York, or maybe even the country, the fact that this boat was sailing around with 900 people on it and didn't have any place to settle, and was eventually sent back to Germany. So, and my father, 900 Jews were looking for a place of refuge, and they were denied entry to the U.S., and they were denied entry to Cuba and all ports in South America, and they ended up going back to Germany to an uncertain fate. Well, not so uncertain, very certain fate. Also, I'm a writer because of columnists. I read the New York Post from right to left, like the Bible, like the Hebrew Bible, as a kid. When I was 10 years old, I was a sports fan. First thing I read was a sports page. Then I read Milton Gross, then Jimmy Cannon, and then on to the editorial page, which was Murray Kempton, Max Lerner, who I didn't understand, Murray Kempton, who I didn't understand, but I loved to read. And the same thing with Jimmy Cannon. At the age of 10 or 11, I didn't really know what these guys were talking about. But I loved the way they wrote. And I think they kind of introduced me to the mysteries of literature, where you don't really have to know everything, but there's something about the feel, the tension, the irony, things that I could not possibly understand at this age, but that I felt, and that made me a writer. So, yeah, I would read Milton Gross, Jimmy Cannon, Murray Kempton, Leonard Lyons, who, you know, again, I read stuff about people I didn't know anything about, and then Earl Wilson. Leonard Lyons was like a high-class gossip columnist. He didn't bother with, you know, Tin Pan Alley show business people. He only dealt with writers, actors, diplomats. He had very high-class gossip about Winston Churchill and, you know, Ernest Hemingway, people like that, you know. Earl Wilson did the Midnight Earl. He covered nightclubs. And when I later went to work for the Post on Night Rewrite, he would call me up, half in the bag, you know, and would read his story to me. He'd dictate his story to me. So, I mean, in a sense, I really am a writer because of reading those guys and kind of knowing that there was something more to reading and to literature than having to definitely understand every word, which I did not at that point.
Josh?
Sure. Well, I'll talk about what I look for kind of in columns as an op-ed person, as an op-ed editor. And I think the best way at first to understand what makes a great column is to understand what doesn't. We have tons and tons of punditry out there in the world right now. We're going to all go watch a Republican debate and then watch people be pundits after it. To me, why punditry falls short of columnizing, for lack of a better word, is number one, we're all looking at the same events. We're all looking at the same events from the same angles. And then we're very, very quickly, I mean, Michael talked about, deadlines of hours. Punditry now, deadlines of minutes, sometimes down to seconds, trying to beat the other person with a very, very conventional and often predictable take. So to me, and often partisan take as well. So there are a series of things that to me make a good column a good column. One, facts, actual facts in it, and hopefully new facts that have not been exposed, that the reader has not yet been exposed to. This is where reported columns, are increasingly rare, but they're incredibly valuable art form. Second, voice. Everyone's talked about voice, but this is just something, it's either there or it's not. It is very rare that a piece of punditry will have a true voice to it. Will actually, the person who's writing it will come through without necessarily saying I. You'll just know who they are through the writing. Related is passion. Punditry is often very, very distanced and almost cynical in the way that it dissects what's going on. The columnist can be very, very close to what he or she is writing about, and the passion will come through. Another related one is unpredictability, which Michael talked about. I think the best columnists, you come to trust them, but you don't necessarily know exactly what they're going to say. There are people who defy this rule sometimes. I mean, Paul Krugman's an effective columnist. You pretty much know where he's going to come down, but he finds a slightly different way to say it each time, and he says it with volume and with passion. And so you don't need all of these ingredients every single time. And then I would say independence, which is related to unpredictability, but different. I mean, Stanley Crouch is in this collection, and he's a columnist at the Daily News. And he is culturally and politically independent. He's a kind of lives on his own island. And he knows what his ideology is. He knows what his worldview is. And it's nobody else's worldview necessarily. And that can be a challenge to relate that to the reader. But it's what makes you worth reading. And we have this giant blob out there where you can kind of get as much opinion as you want. But the reason why you return to an individual writer is because of something that person brings that nobody else particularly does.
Thanks, Josh. Harry, you want to talk a bit about the column in the age of the internet?
Sure. So let me start off with a very quick defense of the column. The Haggerty trial, to me, is the perfect form for the columnist. There's not actually any big news there. This is $1 million that this guy may or may not have stolen in this very convoluted way with money donated by the mayor as a private citizen to a political party. You can get into the weeds very quickly. There are questions about what the Bloomberg administration is, but there aren't actually any giant moral issues getting sussed out here. And the defendant, is not actually offering a defense in terms of, I did not take the $1 million very seriously. Although we would like it to be slightly less than $1 million because that would affect the jail time he could potentially have. So it turns out that there are actually really large issues that Michael has gotten at, I thought, very effectively, and I've gotten at a little less effectively. I'm also just starting off as a columnist. I'm about 7 weeks in at The Voice. And so I've been thinking a lot of these things through in the sort of active way you'll do at the start of a new endeavor. But it raises questions about what the administration is, how it purchases influence, what's fair as distinct from what's legal, and how it operates that are really significant for the sort of city we want and the sort of city we want going forward. And that's not something an editorial can effectively get at. And straight news stories about this, if you're not a political junkie, are boring. They're things people skip right by if you're not already plugged into the issue. And so having a voice and an ability to frame the scene and something Josh was saying, pick something that matters and show why it's important is incredibly valuable, I think. I mean, obviously, the word columnist itself indicates its relationship to the physical form, and I'm skeptical about the prospects going forward. It is one of those almost you know it when you see it roles. It's reporting, but it's also opinion and voice, and these parts are all muddled together. And with the commentary as prevalent as it is on the internet, talk has gone from cheap to nearly completely worthless. And so the question is what the columnist is bringing to the table. There's some incredible examples in this book in surprising places. Actually, go back one step. When I was at Politico, before I came to The Voice, one of the things I had to do, which was a form of punditry, really mechanical punditry, was during the election cycle, I wrote who won the day every day. And I guess it's about 45 days out, but when the economic crisis really starts and McCain rolls up his sleeves and suspends his campaign, I went to my bosses and said, well, Obama wins every day because he's going to be president and this other guy isn't. And the response was, which was completely reasonable, and these are not selfish or foolish people, is nobody wants to read that. People are very, very excited about the horse race. And column writing at its worst, and a lot of sports writers fall into this, really is just this mechanical thing where you're taking somewhat random or staged events and then throwing a moral meaning on them. And one of the columns that stuck out to me the most in the book, which I hadn't read before, is the great W.C. Heinz's column, Death of a Racehorse, which is just incredibly beautiful writing. I'm going to read just very quickly the very end of it. It stuck with me. Heinz, I always thought was both a better novelist and a better journalist than Hemingway was frequently compared to, and Hemingway was a big fan of his. But I'm going to stall for time for 1 second while I try to find that. I have the page mark. But going forward, the real questions about whether or not that form and the idea that a 900-word space that appears at set times,
123 here.
Thank you, is the ideal way to get that sort of voice and that sort of perspective across. Frankly, I really doubt it. I came up just early enough to be a newspaper guy, and I'm not really qualified for anything else. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to join this field that I expect is not necessarily going to be around that much longer. And to go back to something John said, television, I think, played a role there too. When you're reading these early columns, the ability to paint a picture verbally and to show the meanings or implications of that with visual imagery are just remarkable. One of the people, well, one of the people I would have liked to have seen in the book, and since these guys did the hard work of producing it, I can now quibble, is Joseph Roth, the great novelist who is also a fantastic journalist and was painting these scenes of exiles in tween war Europe and displaced populations and soldiers returning home. All of this displacement in journalism in ways that were just remarkable and morally charged. So the end of this Heinz story, and then I'll be done, is there's this highly touted racehorse, and it's on the track, and it trips, and it's going to be put down. Then the heavens open, the rain pouring down, the lightning flashing, and they rush for cover of the stables, leaving alone on his side near a pile of bricks, the rain running off his hide, dead an hour and a quarter after his first start, airlift, son of bold venture, full brother of assault. And it's simple, and it's humble, and it's charged. And instead of political writing often following the worst of sports writing, this was sports writing that has real moral weight and meaning. And I hope is the sort of thing, just as writers, we're all aspiring to.
Phip, you want to defend the fact that you didn't include the famous Austrian writer Joseph Roth in your collection of American columnists?
Yeah. I think I can sleep with that for now, but it's good for volume 2. It has been amazing. Everyone, people who reading the book coming back and saying, you should have put this in, you should have put that in, and And that's been one of the fun things about this. Is part of the goal, we didn't think this was definitive. We considered it a start, and we wanted to start a conversation. And it's doing that, and I hope it'll do it a lot more. To what Harry said, though, I mean, about we do easily, especially with online writing, this is Josh's point too, we can get very reactive, very superficial, putting clever over anything that aspires to seeing clearly or figuring out what the moral weight is of questions, especially in covering politics. It is an enormously important effort, I think, to avoid writing process stories because they're easy and they're cheap, and I think they add almost no value.
What do you mean by process stories?
I mean, right now, I mean, one of the big problems in politics, and I worked on the other side in government as well. It's very difficult to get people to cover even content because they're more interested in covering the process story, which is the theoretically behind-the-scenes, big-picture look at how this move plays out in the whole field. And the reality is, I think it's actually just lazy reporting much of the time. It's easy to do because you just have to take your own counsel. Whereas as actual reporting or actual analysis requires a little more work. But I do think, Wells Twombly was one of the guys I walked away from this book really impressed with. He died in 1970s. Very obscure. I couldn't find, he never wrote a book. He has a column in here about Casey Stengel, which blew my mind. And one of the things I want to come from this book is, for more of these authors to become better known. I mean, the fact that Jimmy Breslin's books aren't readily available in print now is insane to me. They should all be. I mean, I hope, I'd like to see just greater appreciation for all these guys. But Wells Twombly was a fascination. And he wrote something that I think is still true today, even though he was writing this in the 70s when television was the enemy, not the internet or tweeting. He said, I don't want anybody skimming through anything I write. I've been battling the who, what, when, where, why crowd and KISS crowd, keep it simple, stupid, ever since I started. He said, Lord, we're in a war with television. I want to try to recreate scenes for readers, to take them places where even the damn camera can't go. And I think that's still our obligation. And the question is really having enough time to do the craftsmanship and imagination. Because we default to references now. I mean, we don't even tell stories anymore. We make references. That's a cultural problem, but it affects columnists as well. So I think there's an obligation to consciously try to up our game and to think that way.
I think another issue is so much columnizing is about politics now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're writing about politics, it is reasonable to write about policy and even occasionally process if the campaign manager has left and then why did the campaign manager leave and why is the campaign in disarray. That could be relevant at any given time if your job is 80% writing about politics or 90% writing about politics. The best columns in here and the best columns in general are maybe about politics, but they're also about just human beings and the way we live and why we live the way we live. And and actually, I think sometimes if you apply the kind of the anecdotal school of writing to politics, that can sometimes produce problems in interesting ways because, the candidate is not necessarily the anecdote about the candidate. The candidate, we're supposed to kind of look through the little anecdotes about the candidate and see what policies they're proposing and analyze their policies. And there are ways to look at people in politics that aren't necessarily the same way that we want to scrutinize or reflect upon regular people in the world who are just trying to understand how they fit. And especially now, I mean, there's so much economic turmoil that normal people are going through. There's so much cultural confusion of different kinds. There's a lot to really dig into and write about and understand. That I think we've moved so much into the political realm with columnizing that we don't really think that much about people on the ground. And it's very hard for me as an op-ed editor to get enough pieces that are really about, closely observed pieces about the way people live in the city.
I was struck by the fact that in this column, in this collection, the one thing that sticks out is sympathy. The columnists have a lot of sympathy. Kempton, all the guys you were talking about, Breslin, Hamill, they write feelingly about people. I was watching C-SPAN the other night, and I saw a great Murray Kempton column. These people who are protesting the pipeline that's going to go from Canada all the way through the Middle West into Austin. Murray Kempton would have covered that hearing, and he would have written about these people who came up so heartfelt in tears. No one covered it. I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything in the papers either. This is something that Kempton would have written about. Jimmy Cannon would have found great pathos in Michael Vick's total collapse. This guy he's ruined, and it's awful. So that's a thing I'm struck by.
There are people, believe it or not, there are people who don't know who Michael Vick is.
There's nobody here who doesn't know who Michael Vick is. Raise your hand if you don't know who Michael Vick is. Get out. I'll tell you later.
But instead you get 100 columns about whether or not Christie's going to run for 3 weeks. I mean, it's become completely absurd. And those columns are asked for. I mean, they're imposed upon columnists as much as anything else.
There's two key things here. The first is metrics have been very bad in the short term for the sort of stuff people write. If you really want to boil it down, what makes money on the internet is pornography, which is not the business we've gotten into. But at that point, newspapers, editors used to have all this covered that people cared about foreign news that's very expensive to produce, and certain sorts of offbeat stories that the writers like. And it turns out readers often aren't all that interested in, or they don't click it as often as they will cute puppy pictures.
What do you
a
mean by
horse-race
metrics,
story.
Harry?
Numbers. The numbers they're using to measure how many people are reading it to charge advertisers. The other
In other words, you're saying how many clicks?
Yeah, and search engine optimization, which I don't know if you're going to talk about. You keep going, and then I'll
Look, the guys who are writing these had sort of guts that none of us have to. They didn't know when they were producing their columns what anyone else was going to say. If Michael and I are in the same courtroom, maybe he's on Twitter or I'm on Twitter. Certainly there's 35 other reporters there, 15 of whom are tweeting furiously. And if you're thinking something that turns out to be way off base, or just is way outside their box, people notice that, and you notice before your story. You're seeing what other people are producing right away. You're thinking about it. These are your peers. And this is a very new development, and I think it eliminates some of those strains, and I think it eliminates a fair amount of the human empathy because people necessarily are looking at the characters and the narrative that's going to play. And just as a selfish journalist, if you're part of that conversation, other people are more likely to link to your work or retweet it or riff off of it. And if you're off on a different page entirely. So one of the things that really grabbed me at the Haggerty trial is the courtroom is so shabby. Everything in the trial is misnamed. It's the Supreme Court, which is like criminal court in New York. It's actually a very low court. The In God We Trust on the wall, 3 of the letters came off, so they got replaced by less shiny letters that are not sized the same. On the second day of the trial, there was a very pregnant, fat, like 20-year-old woman who'd beaten someone up who was pleading down right after, while Kevin Sheeky, who's one of the deputy mayors, was waiting to come back on the stand, and they were just quickly dealing with their other business. There's this profound shabbiness that's fascinating, but it's not really part of the conversation with other journalists or that straight, narrow path that you know is going to get you attention. So I think that's pushed us away from that sort of compelling column writing in ways that have not been healthy, and I hope will change with more intelligent metrics in the future.
Actually, if I could, I disagree with that. I mean, I think that, or I agree very much with your impulse, right? That is what makes good writing. And yeah, I mean, I think, we have a choice. We can tweet and you can sort of figure out what the wisdom of the idiot crowd of journalists is, or you can't, right? Or you can choose to ignore it. You can kind of go back and write about these curious disjunctions that you see in the courtroom and that sort of thing. And I guess I guess I don't have any, so, obviously underneath I'm agreeing with you, but I don't have really any patience with the argument that you hear so often now that, oh, well, the other 8 yutzes in the court with you are, writing about X and therefore to be part of the conversation. I actually think that even sometimes in our supreme self-absorption, right, or the absorption of reporters, that you recognize when somebody's hit one, right? And usually when they've hit one because it's not what the other
exactly right.
4 people are writing about. And I frankly, I think of the good columnists out there, and there's a very good colleague of mine, Jim Dwyer, who's not here, goes his way very often. I mean, it's true of many, many columnists, of the good ones. And, of the, sort of the herd, if you will, of political kind of bloggers and writers, unfortunately, of whom about 80% are utterly forgettable, I think it's not surprising. They don't bring observation to the table. They don't bring independent thought, and therefore, they're forgettable.
Right. This is the difference between what a columnist ought to be and why so many of the columns in this book are so remarkable, and what somebody who's covering every political tick and talk is. And that's a job and a living, and some of them are important, but they ought to be very distinct roles, and I'm worried that there are places at which I think the Times has been really well insulated from this, and that's great, where there's been increased blending of those two roles. That's been difficult to avoid, but I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a legitimate question, like what kinds of columnists are being cultivated, like in this atmosphere. And one of the things that online there is a certain pressure or pull, for instance, just in a headline, to write a headline that is search engine optimized, right? That is SEO friendly. And this means, and actually David Carr wrote a great funny piece on this a couple of years ago, in which he put Britney Spears. No, it wasn't. It was Tyler Momsen, who had nothing to do with the subject of the piece, who's a star. He put it in the headline, just to demonstrate that this would get a certain number of hits online. And so you can have actually a very interesting column, theoretically, and even the headline will wind up being kind of corrupted so that when somebody goes and they type in, Rick Perry rock, they will possibly get pushed to this column. And it's actually not just the headline, it's also the lead. And there are all kinds of things that you are told in a particular journalistic environment that it would be good to do because more people might come and visit and read your piece. And if you want, and what good is your piece if nobody reads it, right? Even if it is intelligent, right? So it's interesting. I mean, it's not. I agree with you, and it's people's own fault ultimately if they don't do anything interesting at all. But I think we are dragging people. People are getting dragged by the kind of forces that are out there in a direction that is not necessarily healthy. I mean, if you look at the headlines here, none of these are search engine optimized.
That's right. Yes, by definition.
They're good headlines.
Phip, let me ask you something. There's a standard format in talk radio. John Batchelor's show, who you're on, is completely different. It stands out by itself. How does Batchelor manage to project this very different, far more substantive voice and put it over when he has so much competition that is kind of standard issue opinion journalism on the radio?
Right. Well, I think it's not unrelated to the dynamic everyone's discussing, which is that if you zig when everyone else is zagging, to relate it to a really dumb sports soundbite, there's value in that. People will seek it out because it stands out. And I think one of the real problems, not just we talk about the relationship between talk radio and a new generation of partisan columnists who, probably are more fairly called pundit, but there's enormous gravitational pull to just come up with a new crop of angry talking point people. And those folks will do well. And they'll even have little niches, like who's the next Ann Coulter? Who can I place in that slot? And you just contrast the New York Post columnists. I mean, a lot of the great columnists, they did not write for the New York Times or the Washington Post. They wrote for tabloids. Absolutely. Right? I mean, Royko, tabloid. Breslin, tabloid. Kempton, tabloid. I mean, and just the sheer number of New York Post columnists in this book from back in the day, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then, not to throw anyone under the bus, but contrast that with some of the columnists who run now, where it's it's an ideological project. And it's very, very partisan. I think ultimately, I do think we're at a point where people are getting sick of that because they're so inundated by it. And I think they will seek out and reward an alternative, which is why I think Batchelor is doing well in the radio format, because he's doing something different. But that definitely requires being countercyclical. It requires more than a little bit of courage, because right now you get rewarded in the renewed partisan media environment we're in. You get rewarded if you're louder, angrier, and ultimately more conformist. And I can't tell you how many columnists, friends of mine, who are even conservative columnists, they'll stray off the reservation and they'll get punished for it, which is a psychotic thing. But I think that increasingly, if I fall short of this standard all the time, but I think there's really an obligation for those who are writing columns to try very consciously to not do what other people are doing, to try to find that additional angle, to do the reported column, and to maybe and the hope being is that at the end of the day that helps maybe change the environment. But right now, snark, for example, look at just Twitter. Snark gets rewarded. sympathy, can't do it in 140 characters. So, I mean, there are real challenges here, but I think they're worth
When Steve
confronting.
Jobs dies, you can do it.
You can do it.
But yeah.
Snark, it's just the kind of,
It's an attitude.
yeah, it's a sarcastic, dismissive, cynical, quick take. And it is the single predominant characteristic in columnists today. And I think it's soulless.
Heywood, when you look at today's columnists, which one of those who write columns today do you think captures some of these qualities we associate with the older columnists? Are there any you look to and say, I want to, and not just in the papers we mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. Are there any people you say, I want to? Sometimes Steve Lopez, who I think
Lopez is in here and he's great. He's perfect.
Steve Lopez of the LA Times, John Cass of the Chicago Tribune, I don't think is in
He's
here.
not.
He's for the second. He's for the second
There you
volume.
Like Jim Dwyer.
Jim Dwyer is for the second volume. Are there any people that come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, when I lived in LA, I read Steve Lopez all the time, and he also discovered a guy who had been he'd been a cello virtuoso, and he was a schizophrenic in the Mission District, and he wrote a series of columns about this guy, which went on for weeks or months about how people were trying to help him, doctors coming down, cure him. They made a movie out of it. And the thing about it was, that it kept people's interest in L.A., which is, kind of like an interesting thing to do. And but it really did. And I read him every day. Also read Jim Dwyer, actually. It's funny in a way, and maybe just as me because I'm an old guy. I can't think of anybody who writes only online who I read for column eloquence. I read a story, like a news story, obviously, online. But I can't think of anybody and that's my fault, I'm sure, but I just can't think of anybody at the top of my head. So it's Dwyer, it's Lopez. I really can't think of that much more, that many more people. People on the New York Post infuriate me. My old paper, my alma mater. Andrea Prizer's a nut. She makes me, I can't stand her. Michael Godwin, who I could see his, I'm sorry, Godwin was the anarchist, right? I could see his point of view. He's become tedious, tendentious, repetitive,
He was supposed to be here tonight. I'm glad that didn't work out.
I'm sorry I missed him. Ralph Gardner on the Wall Street Journal set up a woman today in his column, which I thought was really terrible. She's a woman who wrote a children's book. He didn't particularly like it. She belongs to a firearms club. He goes down to the firearms club with her onto the shooting range. In the middle of the column, he destroys the book she wrote. He then writes a snarky last line, and I feel like writing an email saying that, listen, I know who this woman is. She's an Upper East Side spoiled, silly lady, but you set her up, and that's not fair. Because she thought she was having a column that was promoting her book, that was lacking her book, and instead you bury her, So I can't think of any people other than Dwyer and Lopez and.
I think Peggy Noonan is
Yeah, Peggy
Peggy's
Noonan.
in the book.
yeah, Peggy's in the book.
Peggy's in the book.
Peggy's
Yeah,
great.
Peggy Noonan too. Right.
I don't know if people ever read Brett Stevens in the Journal. He's another. He writes beautifully. And he gives you the feel for foreign situations. He has a sense of the internal life of what he's writing about. At this point, let me turn it over to you, the audience. And I know there's some of you in the audience who are in journalism and write about these things. And maybe you have some thoughts or any particular questions you want to ask.
Okay, I guess, on the question of who decides, at least, and I assume it's the same with Harry, I do. If for better or no doubt for worse. I decide in any given week when I'm going to write about it. Every once in a while, I'll have a couple of ideas sort of competing with each other, and I'll take them to my editor, and I'll say, which catches your fancy, take me out of my misery. And she will, and she'll tell me, and that's extremely useful. But the only thing I will then say, a long list of questions, but I think the reporting is intensely important to a good column. And there is nothing more dreary than reading a column that is informed only by the relatively prosaic thoughts that are sort of spilling out of our heads on deadline. And the other is to have passion. I think that there's there's no great harm, and in fact, as we're doing this weekly or bi-weekly or whatever, there's no great danger in being wrong occasionally, right? I mean, and in fact, but really the worst thing is simply not to care about things. I always say, just parenthetically, I don't believe in objectivity in journalism. I believe in fairness. Why? Because I don't believe, at least as a born and bred New Yorker, that there is an issue I could possibly cover that I wouldn't have a thought going in on, right? I'm an opinionated guy. What I hope is that I have the intellectual sort of decency and integrity to let facts and let alternative thinking and alternative arguments get in my way. But goddamn it, have passion. Go out there, you know, there's a reason the world is alive with all sorts of dangerous and in some cases intriguing forces right now, whether it's in the city, whether it's in the nation, whether it's in the world. And to go out there with a real passion for that and with a real eye so that you're both reporting and thinking and stretching yourself is really one of the great privileges you can have as a reporter or a writer. And I just sort of, to my mind, a columnist, you get a little more elbow room with all of those.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I'll pick up a couple of yours. First of all, the right way to get your teacher students about the art of the column is to buy and read this book and assign it in your classroom. That's an easy answer. The art of the lead is really, really key, and I think it's one of the things, frankly, that probably spurred us to put together the book is when you're looking at that blank piece of paper, you know, that's one of the creative things here. It is a creative process. And the question is, you know, how do you begin? And there are 800,000 different takes you can make. And so that was part of it is, so what are some of the best? What works? And you can read through any of these columns and you'll see different leads and you can learn from them. And then you know, come up with sports columns in particular, you'll see, I think, sports columnists mastered the art of the lead, especially, you know, the you know, Red Smith, Grantland Rice, Jimmy Cannon. I mean, you know, Bob Considine in his piece on Joe Louis and Max Schmeling is a great lead. But I think bottom line it is, what I think we need to really preserve is that idea of not just of the reported column, because I'm sort of disgusted by columns that are just opinion, and I'm disgusted at it myself when I do it, and I do it. You know, you do it under deadline, and you try to make sure the quality is enough so that it's not just, you know, because really, who gives a damn? I mean, you know, I think someone's opinions on their own aren't worth a lot, and it's a waste of the reader's time. I think if it's reported and crafted, that becomes a different thing. And that's what's so inspiring here is you do get a sense of that craftsmanship. And that's where the editing, you know, we have a real opportunity writing with computers too, where we can, you can craft it, you can, you know, and you know, when you realize, you just look at the Breslin stuff after the death of JFK, or one of my favorite pieces in the column, after the death of John Lennon. You know, he wrote that in 3 hours. That's a deadline artist. That's the whole idea of the book. And, you know, that's what we should be aspiring to.
I want to say something in defense of the non-reported column. You know, if you look at, say, Krauthammer, who's got something in here, you look at David Brooks, you know, you can write a column that is pure argument, that is purely about ideas, that is incredibly convincing. That's true. Depending on how honest, depending on whether it feels like it's reasoned from first principles, if it's not glib, if it's not packaged, if it takes the reader through the argument really effectively. I disagree with most things that Charles Krauthammer writes. I find him to be an extraordinarily good columnist. I think he's a great columnist. You know, even though he infuriates me sometimes. In a way that some other, you know, folks who write very, very similar things don't grab me, simply because I don't feel like they're really arguing effectively. I also will say, though, one of the great things about reporting a column is, you know, I even feel this in my daily life. I think everybody does. When you're sitting behind a desk, when you're sitting behind a computer, your brain doesn't function the same way as when you're just out in the world. Even when you're sitting at an event, your eyes are moving around. You're thinking about different things. You're putting ideas together that you just wouldn't if you're sitting just looking at your tweet deck, reading things that other people have written. It's not like that you're brain dead, but it's just that you're not going to ever surprise yourself. Right. And when you are out there in the world, you do surprise yourself. People, you have even the smallest hint of an epiphany. That's a good day.
Harry, do you want to pick up on this?
Just a couple things. In terms of advice for reporters, ask people questions. Figure out how things work. Like, that's basically what the job is, and you're in this sort of really interesting position where a lot of people are very excited that you're asking and will explain things to you. And one of my models for a good column, but I also think works for a lot of straight news reporting, is it's like an interesting conversation with a really sharp person in a bar who's had a couple to drink and will speak openly, but not so many that they're going to fall off the seat. And when it's done, you either know something or you have a way of seeing the world that hadn't been open to you before that seems relevant. And just the chance to go out and things, that people are casually curious about. How's the fur district work? And you go in and you start asking people, like, when do you make most of your sales? What are your customers like? How much of this is cash? And then, just simple sort of dumb questions. And then 10 minutes later, they're telling you all sorts of stories and anecdotes that lead to other things. In terms of leads, on the flip side of that, and there's a good reason these guys aren't in this book, but, Juan Gonzalez has probably broken more news than any other columnist in New York over the last 10 years.
He was invited tonight. I'm sorry he didn't come.
And it's funny, I don't always share his national or local politics, and he's just a guy who pays attention and asks straightforward questions, and in a very disappointing way, I think, because he's been so good at picking up some of these stories that haven't gotten, reporters can be territorial, and the zigging and zagging thing, other people sometimes haven't picked up on them because they've been his story. Wayne Barrett, and these are two guys, neither of whom are terribly distinguished writers. Barrett is this incredible digger and finds things in paper trails that nobody else has seen. And there is a column tradition that is very separate from the beautiful or the poetic column or the one that has a value as prose, that is just exposing information that hadn't been previously available or part of the narrative, and putting that into the conversation that there's no reason to anthologize, and they're only relevant to the extent they're driving that forward, but can be tremendously important.
I want to say something on behalf of Andrea Pizer before, and then I'll let Heywood speak. I never read Andrea Pizer. I find her. Andrea Pizer actually did a really good reported column on Zuccotti Park.
No, she had one good observation.
No, she didn't.
She had one good observation I mentioned to my father, because I've been stunned because her material is so predictable and so ideological to actually see her everywhere. And she actually does spend a lot of time observing and reporting before insulting pretty much everyone who doesn't match a certain right-wing narrative. Right. She did have one sharp observation, or otherwise lunatic column about Zuccotti Park, about how the people in the West are much more crusty punk, and then as you move east, there's a more organized informational culture. I was surprised no one else had picked up before and impressed yet.
I'll say nothing further on this.
But
It's like being at a dinner table.
I just wanted, I don't do this, and I never did. I never wrote a column. I was a reporter. All I want to do is transmit some of the advice that I got from the old guys when I worked for the Post, which was never trust your first impression. Go back and take another look at what's happened. And also, don't think that because it's a kind of cut and dry story that that's all there is to it. A police story or a press conference even. Something that you're sent to cover, it's kind of humdrum, or you think it's kind of humdrum, but it's not. There's a story there that you can find. So those are two things. Those are things that and that was great advice, especially not to trust my first impression, because my first impression was always cross-referential. I shared with everybody else. I had to go a little bit deeper and try to see what was there. And there always is a story, which is pretty amazing, actually. So that's the advice I got. As far as writing columns is concerned, when I got this book, I said, well, here's how I'll know how to, read this book, because I got it late and I didn't think I could read the whole book in time. I'll just look at every column and I'll see if the lead grabs me. If it does, I'll read the column. I had to stop doing that because I would say almost every lead, I'd say 98% of the leads in this book really grabbed me. So I had to change my criteria. Yeah.
We
Or
still have
phone or your
novels.
iPod.
We still have short stories.
Right.
There are many ways to write. And it may not be a dominant or as celebrated a form as it once was in every way, but there will be there's a place for it, and there's always a place for a great version of whatever it is that you're talking about. So someone who writes great columns, there will always be a place for that, I think.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, first of all, you don't want the rules of search engine optimization to dominate your thinking about your lead or anything else. One way I think we've gotten around that at the Daily Beast, for example, is you'll see we've got a head and a deck that are written by editors, not me, and those are written to be search engine optimized. Therefore, I don't have to screw around with my lead. I can be whatever I want it to be, which is a great deal of freedom. One of the reasons I think being a columnist is one of the better jobs in the world. But I think actually there's probably more of a need for literary journalism than ever before, because there's so much pure opinion or partisan takes on things that I think an attempt at literary journalism could actually stand out more. And one of the virtues of the column as a form, I think, in our time today, is that 600, 800, 1,000 words, it's relatively compact. It still works for short attention spans, and more people will read a column, whether it's online or in a paper, than necessarily number of people will buy a given novel. So I think there's actually an opportunity and obligation to raise your game in that regard.
I think one of the things that a columnist can do, if the columnist is rigorous, is earn people's trust over time.
Yeah.
This is what a person who's excessively partisan or knee-jerk in any way just sees things the way that they're supposed to be seen by a person with that worldview will, excite the people who that person wants to excite, and nobody else will be moved, or nobody else will kind of it won't spark anyone to think differently about anything. But over time, if you write and you're grounded in reality, I think you have the opportunity to gain people's trust over time. That's as both a journalist and as a columnist.
Heywood?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you can't use TV as an excuse not to be a vivid writer.
Right. Right.
You can paint a picture in words, and that's what people are still reading. And as long as they're still reading, you can be vivid and visual. And TV can't stop you or shouldn't stop you, because first of all, TV will never be able to paint the picture in words that you can paint. And the people who go into TV journalism, I was watching Zuccotti Park, by the way, which is another opportunity, for stories that's been missed, because TV allegedly has covered it. They've gone around and stuck mics in people's faces, and the guy with the biggest mouth who said the most interesting soundbite, gets the coverage. But a lot of the stories were not covered. That's left for print journalists, and they're still around.
Well, I think actually it's good. Both are good questions. The older columnists, many of whom are represented in this book and were brilliant, like Breslin, used to write 4 and 5, 6 times a week. So to a certain extent, there's the crucible of deadline and of being on deadline all the time can focus the mind. Now, it should also be said, Breslin, could write 2 or 3 not so good ones in a week and have a couple brilliant ones. I mean, nobody
bats 1,000.
Nobody's batting 1,000, right? To use the baseball metaphor. But I mean, there is a virtue, I think, to writing quickly. I think what Harry was getting at earlier, and all of us have been, is the challenge in this sort of cacophonous age, right, of a million different bloggers and columnists, and the extent to which things like Twitter start to, if you will, sort of pre-form opinion, even before you've sat down to start typing, are the real problems, the real challenges. And I think that, that one of the arguments there, again, at least for a certain kind of column, goes back to either reporting or thinking an original thought, and that very often involves turning off the computer, turning off Twitter, going out and reporting, sitting and thinking, reading whatever, the New York Review of Books, commentary, things that are really going to sort of, if you will, start making your mind fire in interesting ways. But I get very impatient with the argument that it can't be done.
Right.
It's just a question of doing it.
The form can change. The form will change. So don't get attached to the form. The content's the thing, and there's no barrier. I mean, you have more people having more access to writing an opinion column than ever before, and there's no reason people can't aspire to doing a reported column online. I mean, and the deadline is, as Michael said, is no excuse. Sure, it's more difficult, sure, but so what? You got to deal.
All these rules and all these incentives are going to change constantly and quickly. So people are thinking about Twitter now. We're thinking about blogs a few years ago. When you're asking about SEO optimization and leads, these bots and the people creating them aren't stupid either, and they're getting more sophisticated with what they're tracking and what sort of information they can pick up, and spending a lot of time thinking about how to game this, as opposed to what's actually interesting and how are you going to let people know this is a tremendous drain or drag, and I just don't think it is time well spent. Like, these parts will change, and it's like a nice narrow beat if you're interested in the convergence of technology and news to deal with exactly that. But otherwise, just find news, go out, observe, interact, engage, hit parts that matter, and there'll be a market for that. It might get smaller or larger with time, but I try not to worry about it any more than necessary.
Can I just say one thing? I think the bosses have too much power, and I'm old enough to remember when you had a lot more autonomy in newspaper work, and even in what I ended up doing, which was writing books and TV and movies, in which the boss would come down and respected what you were doing. You'd get ripped off, you'd be exploited on and on. But the
Why
truth
did that change, Heywood?
I puzzle about that. I can only come up with the stock, kind of explanations. I don't know what happened, but it happened about 15 years ago, which the people who run the large media conglomerates set policy more and more, set editorial policy more and more, and slowly started to believe that they were better at doing our jobs than we were, and that they could tell us what to do because they were better at it. And we were just kind of their amanuenses. And I don't know how, that's something I just observed. And I don't know how that's going to change.
The point of the book wasn't to bury the column, but to praise it, right? I mean, the whole point of the book is to put in one place, because this stuff isn't available online. I remember when we were in the anniversary of John Lennon's assassination, I called Josh because I was trying to see if I could get a link to this column online, because I wanted to reference it in a column I was writing on the Beast, and it wasn't. It just didn't. So I mean, so one of the points of this book is to collect these pieces in a way that shows people how good a column can be. Because, this is all, the macro sense, we're living in a time when people are writing obituaries for newspapers every day, but opinion writing is proliferating like never before online. Right. And it doesn't need just to be typing. There's this exact same opportunity for storytelling, for vivid descriptive writing as there was before. It's just, I think in some cases we don't have those examples as close by. And so that was the whole point of this book, is to make them a little bit more accessible so that people realize that you can do this, you can do it this way too.
Mm-hmm. And Heywood's right that Zuccotti Park is an excellent example of this. Right. You cannot go there for 2 hours without just seeing children and park people and parading. And there are all of these more interesting strains. I mean, 2 hours. There's no way to capture a lot of that on television. And right. these print reporters and columnists who are really investing time and figuring parts of it out, all of them are sensible, have very sort of mixed feelings, I think, about the whole thing, but they're very different from the mixed feelings they're coming in with, and that engagement mm-hmm. is really surprising and useful, and I don't think there's any other way to get there other than sort of putting in the time and coming in on the sort of assignment, figure out what you think of this, and then say something.
Just want to say, in terms of what Freddie said before about the form of the column, there are a number of tremendous British columnists. There's a man named Nick Cohn who writes for The Independent. John Lloyd, who writes for the I'm not sure if he still writes for the Financial Times. I'm missing a financial journalist is just slipping from my mind. I read him every week in the Financial Times. The best French column I ever read was Raymond Aron, the great Raymond Aron, the political philosopher, wrote a column for the French weekly L'Express. There's a column now that appears only online in the Asia Times by a man named David Goldman, who writes under the name of Spengler. And Spengler brings he brings demographics to the table. So when he writes a column, it's passionate, it's informed, and he brings to you information. It was reading David Goldman that I discovered that during this Egyptian revolution, when everyone was talking about how everything was going to work out peachy keen, found out that Egypt was importing half its calories every year.
Huh.
That Egypt is on the verge of economic collapse. In any case, let me stop here. First of all, let me thank you all for being here, and thank the panelists.
Thank you.
And I hope some of you will now go and buy the book.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Tell your friend.
Book.